to Psychedelics Today. I am joined by Graham Hancock today. Graham, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Wonderful.
Good to talk to you.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm really excited about today. I've been following your work probably, I think I was first exposed to your work in around 2007, right after my undergrad was completed. And I think that's right around when you started to get a lot of notoriety. And
Yeah, well, no, actually, I'm afraid the notoriety has been around longer than that. Every time when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, that caused a huge amount of controversy and notoriety as well. But it comes with the territory. If you're saying unusual things and not sticking to the mainstream line, it's inevitable.
yeah, and we'll get into why I feel similarly in a lot of ways. I'll say a lot of things regularly in the psychedelic space that aren't super popular, but I think it's really important to say the truth as much as we can.
It is.
Yeah. So I guess before we dig into your current work and your new TV show and some of your recent books, how did you get your start? From what I understand, you're working for The Economist, doing some interesting stuff in Africa.
Yeah, it goes back before that. I was at university in England, in the north of England, in Durham University, and that was between 1970 and 1973. It was only really when I went to university that I began to wake up. I just couldn't connect with the education system in school, but I somehow scraped into university. And there I found myself in a completely different environment where everything was up to me. And I suddenly felt motivated and interested to train my mind to function better. I think that's the only use of a university course in many cases, is to get the mind asking questions and critical questions. And my degree was in sociology, which back in the early 1970s was a pretty radical discipline. Sadly, not so anymore, but it was then.
Yeah, great.
So that's where it started for me. But then I met my first wife, who was from Somalia, and she was living in England and had been for several years. But then we went out and lived in Somalia for a year, from 1975 to 1976, and that was a fundamental experience to me of a deep immersion in another culture. And it was the beginning of my fascination with Africa, which indeed did lead me into journalism. And my last journalistic role, based at that time out of Nairobi in Kenya, was as the East Africa correspondent for The Economist, which sounds very grand, but actually I was a stringer, paid 50 UK pounds a month as a retainer, and all I could, whatever I earned, depended on the number of lines that I wrote. And the Economist liked really short articles, so that was when I began to discover that I preferred writing things at book length, rather than at 300 words. I had the opportunity in 1982 to write a book about Pakistan, a book called Journey Through Pakistan, with a great photographer friend of mine, the late Muhammad Amin, and that's what really got me started on the book writing side of things.
Brilliant. And when did you get a sense that you might be digging into some interesting topics that the mainstream wasn't all that interested in?
Well, see, in the 1980s, I wrote my book Journey Through Pakistan, which was truly a travel book and a fantastic adventure at the same time. That sort of gave me an appetite for writing books. The next book I wrote was about the Ethiopian famine in 1984, and it was called Ethiopia: The Challenge of Hunger. Just pointing out how badly Ethiopia had been let down by the international community at that time. Then a sort of weird sideways direction, because it had nothing to do with foreign aid, but I ended up writing a book about AIDS. It was called AIDS, the Deadly Epidemic, and that was with a co-author, Enver Karim, and that was published in 1985. It seemed to me the stories of people with AIDS needed to be told and weren't being told properly. So I investigated that and tried to give a different take on that whole issue. And then the book that followed that was a controversial book, and that was called Lords of Poverty. the freewheeling lifestyles, power, prestige, and corruption of the multi-billion-dollar aid business. And it was a critique of foreign aid. I had seen aid in practice. I had seen the misuses of aid. I had seen the way it was used to prop up corrupt dictatorships, to make rich people even richer, and very little of it doing any kind of help at all. So I felt it was time to write a critical book about foreign aid. In those days, criticizing foreign aid was like criticizing motherhood, but I did, and subsequently it has been found to be a useful book. And I would say my analysis of foreign aid in that 1989 book hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is the numbers, which have changed significantly. But if you'll forgive me for rattling on, how did I get where I am from there? Well, what happened was during the 1980s, I had a close working commitment to Ethiopia, and I got to know Ethiopia very, very well. And it was Ethiopia's claim, which seems outlandish to many, to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, that led me to write my first book of historical mystery, which was The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, and that was published in 1992. And that's really where I found that the community of scholars who define themselves as those who must interpret our past to us, namely archaeologists, are not necessarily always correct, that they are opinionated, and that they have a tendency to express their opinions as facts. And archaeologists were sneering and dismissive of the Ethiopian claim, but I found much in Ethiopia that supported it. So I gave their side of the story in that book. And it was the beginning of a long journey into unexplained issues in our past, in history and in prehistory.
I love that. And I think you're right. Historical mystery is a really cool term for that.
Yeah.
And I think, what I got hooked on a while back was historical fiction. People kind of saying like, okay, John Dee meets these other famous alchemists or magicians and blah, blah, blah. I think Umberto Eco did a couple scenes like that. But, maybe that's why I'm so hooked on you, is because it's so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the past is deeply mysterious, and the further back we go, the more mysterious it becomes. And if we're dealing with a situation where there are no written documents, and we have to interpret the past based on rather scarce bits of physical evidence, the role of interpretation becomes very large, and the role of facts actually becomes very small. And that increases the further back into the past we go. So I think there's a huge amount of genuine mystery in the past, and there's an attempt by archaeologists to explain away that mystery. It's one of the odd things about the discipline of archaeology. I have great respect for archaeologists, and I couldn't do any of the work that I do without the fundamental work that archaeologists do. But there seems to be a kind of mission in archaeology, and I'm not even sure where it came from, to bleed all mystery out of the past, to just drain the past of mystery, and to leave nothing there except dry facts, supposed facts, as archaeologists claim, but which, when you dig deep enough, you find are actually interpretations of limited data sets. I don't know why archaeologists want the past to be so boring. Maybe it's because they want to separate themselves off from sort of religious ideas, superstition. They want to be a science. But in the process of trying to make themselves a science, I think they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Of course, there's a need for rigor and discipline, but there's also a need for imagination and openness of mind when it comes to interpreting our collective past. It doesn't belong to one particular group of scholars. It belongs to the whole of humanity, and we all have something to say about it and something useful to put into it.
Yeah. I see similarities in psychology, perhaps too. They're, not necessarily seen as a hard science by groups like physicists, mathematicians, chemists, etc. Archaeology probably somewhat similar.
Yeah. Very, very, very similar. Constantly fighting the battle to be defined as a hard science, and that's so unnecessary. It doesn't really matter whether they're a hard science or not. What matters is, are they producing interpretations of the past that are useful and help us to understand where we came from. And science is regarded as a universal virtue in our culture, and we have a kind of religion of science. But science, as it's defined and as it's deployed in our society today, is really largely, whatever level you're at, it's largely about weighing and measuring and counting. And it's therefore not very useful when it comes to things that can't be weighed or measured or counted. For example, in archaeology, how do you deal with myths? You can't weigh a myth. You can count them. You can say there are X number of myths that tell a similar story, but by and large, archaeology ignores myths because it's not subject to what they call the scientific method. And I think that's a pity because myths that have come down to us from prehistory are the memory bank of our species. And yes, of course, there may be elaborate and fantastical and fictional elements in them, but very often they turn out to contain a substantial core of truth.
So before we go too far into archaeology, I want to touch on supernatural and visionary. Visionary being the updated version. When did those come out?
So the book under the title Supernatural was, and the subtitle of that book, which has remained the same, was Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. And that book was first published in 2005. Last year in 2022, we brought out a slightly expanded version under the new title Visionary. But the main purpose of bringing that out was to allow me to do the narration on the audio version. Because I find when third parties narrate my books that I'm not very happy with them. And previously that book had been narrated by a third party, so I was able to take over the narration and put out my own audio book version of it. It's so much better from an author's point of view. If you can express things in your own voice, you know what to emphasize, you know where you want to lower your tone or raise your tone. And so for all those reasons, I felt it was worth bringing out this new edition. So the book came about because during the 90s, I was all about the possibility of a lost civilization. And what I thought would be my final book, but turned out not to be, in the lost civilization field, was a book called Underworld that I published in 2002. And that was 7 years of work really went into that book, and scuba diving all over the world, looking for parts of the world that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and structures and ruins that fishermen and divers had come across. After I'd done that book, I kind of thought, well, I've done this. I'm not sure I have much more to say about the lost civilization, and I was looking around for another subject, and I became very interested in the story of human origins. What are we? This probably is the fundamental mystery of humanity: is what on earth are we doing here, and how did we get here, and what's it all about? And then I found that the interesting story, certainly back in 2000, in the early 2000s, wasn't so much the physiological or the biological story. It was the evidence of symbolic consciousness emerging in early humanity that really intrigued me. Of course, we've had very interesting developments since then, and I tried to touch on them in the updates. The Neanderthals now are recognized in a totally different way from the way that they were recognized back in the 90s and the early 2000s. We know now that Neanderthals were creative, that they did make art, and we didn't know that in the early 2000s. That's a real revolution that has come through in our understanding of the Neanderthals. And it's better to regard the Neanderthals absolutely as human beings, just like anatomically modern humans. And in fact, we're full of Neanderthal DNA anyway, or at least several percent of it. And then there's the Denisovans, who are another cousin species, also fully human because we anatomically modern humans interbred with them and we carry Denisovan DNA. And again, there's evidence of arts and crafts and symbolism being used by the Denisovans. So I think the horizons for all this have to be pushed back. But the earliest compelling evidence for the use of symbolism to express conscious experiences is in the great cave art that we find all around the world. And whether you find that art 46,000 years ago in Indonesia or 32,000 years ago in Chauvet Cave in France or wherever you care to go, you're going to find incredible similarities. And those similarities include the combination of geometric patterns with entities that one does not normally see in daily life. And those entities will typically be animal-bodied and human-headed, or perhaps human-bodied with an animal head or a bird's head. They're therianthropes. They're a combination of beast and man, and or bird, or fish and man. They're these hybrid entities, which certainly we do not meet in daily life, but we do meet them in deeply altered states of consciousness. And this is something that research that was being done into dimethyltryptamine in the 1990s by Rick Strassman and others was very relevant. There was new work being done on ayahuasca in South America. Ayahuasca is, of course, the active ingredient is dimethyltryptamine, but it's made orally accessible through the addition of a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. There was a lot of great work done by Benny Shannon, for example, the Antipodes of the Mind. And at the same time, shamans in the Amazon, I became aware, were painting their visions. They would come out of the visionary state and they would recall their visions, and they would then paint those recollections. And those paintings included the same geometric patterns and the same therianthropic entities, construed in slightly different ways, but clearly the same kind of encounter is being documented in the cave art from 30 or 40,000 years ago, and is being documented by shamans in the Amazon rainforest today. And what's the common factor? The common factor is altered states of consciousness. And there was excellent work done around that time by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He wrote a fantastic book called The Mind in the Cave. And he argued strongly that what we are looking at in cave art is visionary art, that all the old ideas that this is some kind of hunting magic, which are very patronizing of ancient indigenous peoples, need to be dismissed. We're not dealing with hunting magic here. Actually, only less than 1% of the species depicted on the walls of the French caves are pierced by any kind of projectile, and the rest are not. This is not hunting magic. There's something else going on here. And the suggestion that it was visions in altered states of consciousness that were being depicted just made a whole lot of sense to me. And that then, because I don't like to sit in an armchair and do my research, I have to get out in the field. I have to be part of what I'm writing about. That then meant I needed to go to the Amazon rainforest and drink ayahuasca if I was to write authentically about this extraordinary episode in the human story where we become fully symbolic creatures. Now, we may have been, let's not rule out the possibility that our ancestors were painting their bodies long before they painted the cave walls. And we would have no surviving evidence of that. But the earliest surviving evidence, that I think compelling surviving evidence of the use of visionary plants and fungi is in the cave art that we find all around the world and in the subject matter of the cave art. Occasionally, you will find a hallucinogenic, a psychedelic agent depicted in the cave art. But more often than not, you just look at the art and you know you're looking at visionary art. And visionary art contains the same key ingredients. So I deeply investigated this subject. I had my first 11 journeys with ayahuasca in the Amazon. Extraordinary experience. And it put me in a place where I was competent to write that book, having done all the rest of the research around that subject. And I've continued with ayahuasca since then, not for research purposes, but because it's just so intriguing and so helpful to me.
Mm. Yeah, and 11 experiences in the Amazon is plenty to write. Probably tons.
Well,
it
was a start. It was a start. I was experiencing the medicine in the right place, in the right context. This is I have nothing particularly against, North American or European ayahuasca ceremonies. It need not be confined to a particular area, but very often in North America and Europe, these ayahuasca ceremonies are being conducted incredibly irresponsibly, without any care or concern for what is really going on. And this is what shamanism is partly about. It's about individuals who are enormously experienced in working with these medicines and can use that experience to help people undergoing what can often be very difficult experiences. But there are good ayahuasca ceremonies offered in Europe and North America as well. But I felt it was important to go to the Amazon, and that's what I did. And I hope to be back in the Amazon this year, although it's a very tough environment.
Yeah, yeah. I've never been. The idea of having a big experience with that much wildlife and insects around.
This was one of my problems. Is that spider a vision, or is it real? I think I'll play it safe and assume that it's real. That happened to me. That happened to me quite a bit. And well, I carried on with ayahuasca long after the Amazon, and still do. My last journeys were in 2019 in Costa Rica. I haven't drunk ayahuasca since 2019, but I hope to encounter the brew this year. I guess I've had 75 journeys with ayahuasca, and not everyone is a free pass to a seamlessly convincing parallel universe. Sometimes they're quite void. They call them nadas in the Amazon, but the shamans argue that a nada is a really useful thing to have. That it's a very important part. Don't beat yourself up if you don't have visions. There are other things going on.
I'd agree. Yeah, I'm pretty deep in the holotropic breathwork, Stan Groff world, and those kinds of things do come up.
Yeah, my daughter teaches holotropic breathwork, and it's amazing what breathwork can do. And if you think about it, it's as though nature has taken great care to ensure that we can get into deeply altered states of consciousness if we want to, if we need to. The plants are there to help us, but we have breath work as well. We have meditation, fasting over a long enough period of time will do it. There are all kinds of routes into this area. Now, generally the case that what I call the alert problem-solving state of mind, the alert problem-solving state of consciousness, is a useful state of consciousness. It is the state of consciousness that we largely need to navigate the physical world in the 21st century. But what's wrong with it is it's being presented to us often by scientists as the only worthwhile state of consciousness, and that almost exploring other states of consciousness is somehow an error or a mistake, and you still get the language of the war on drugs being thrown at people who use psychedelics. But what it's fundamentally about is exploring the mystery of consciousness and not being confined to one particular limited window on consciousness. Maybe a useful window. We have to deal with the laws of physics. We have to deal with the physical reality of the world, but that isn't all there is to reality. And that's one of the great teachings, I think, of the plant medicines.
Yeah. Now, one thing that really struck me in Visionary was this comment about psilocybin containing mushrooms never existing in Europe. And one famous mycologist you chatted with said, yeah, there's no evidence like before Columbus discovered the Americas or whatever. Yeah. And then you passed this by Stamets, and Stamets said that's totally absurd. Of course it's there.
And in fact, I had another mycologist do the DNA on Psilocybe semilanciata from North America and Psilocybe semilanciata from Europe. And these psilocybes have been evolving separately for tens of thousands of years, probably hundreds of thousands of years. So it's got absolutely nothing to do with contact between the New World and the Old. But there always were psilocybe mushrooms in Europe, just as there always were in the Americas. The Psilocybe semilanciata, of course, is just one amongst many. There's many more. This is a universally available technique for entering a deeply altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, and a topic I love to bring up. Europeans have been dealing with the Catholic Church kind of stomping out magic for well over 1,000 years, and we don't really talk about that. I was chatting. I had some Twitter comment trying to say that Europeans had access, and somebody was like, "That's the worst of colonialism," suggesting that Europeans had magic and access. That's how I interpreted the statement. But we have all these alchemical texts. We have all sorts of magicians, a large history of witchcraft. Where do you like to go with this topic about like European traditions?
Well, first of all, it's obvious. I do go into it in Supernatural back in 2005, and I do, and I also wrote the foreword to Brian Murarescu's book, the Immortality Key,
I forgot about
because
that.
there's no doubt that the mainstream monotheistic faiths do have their origin in altered states of consciousness. I think to argue differently would be a mistake, but it's particularly true with Christianity. The early Christians were Gnostics, and Gnosticism is about revealed knowledge. It's not stuff you can teach; it's stuff you have to experience, and the experiences unleashed by the plant medicines are exactly the kind of experiences that are described, for example, at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, and these move on into early Christianity. And it was just early Christianity, as I see it and as I've researched it, was multifaceted. There were many different kinds of idea that defined it, that were defined as Christian. It only became crystallized into the Roman Catholic Church when Rome made Christianity the official religion of the state under Constantine. That's when one particular faction of Christianity pulled on the jackboots of the Roman Empire and began to stomp on everyone else and stomp out everyone else, and to deny that there had been any such thing as altered states of consciousness, and to viciously penalize people who explored altered states of consciousness, and in due course, of course, to burn witches at the stake, and to burn so-called witches, and to burn the early Gnostics were also burned at the stake. Clearly, early Catholicism has a great deal to answer for, and it has limited and narrowed down the potential of Christianity. Look, I'm not a Christian. I don't embrace any of the monotheistic faiths, but I do believe that life is deeply mysterious, and that it's the spirit in us, it's the soul in us that matters. I think we're much too focused in the modern world on things, on physical things, on ownership, on possession, on defining ourselves in terms of what we own and what we possess. Science operates in exactly the same way. Materialist reductionism. Everything's got to be reduced to some sort of material process. So consciousness is just an accidental byproduct of brain activity. I mean, all of these things are very unhelpful to us. And I think it's possible to have a deeply spiritual outlook on life without being, a Christian or a Muslim or whatever. I think, and that maybe is the way forward, is that people are going to explore and develop their own spirituality. Why, after all, do we need to be in a hierarchical organization? Why does the priest have to interpret everything for us, to be the intermediary between us and the divine, whatever the divine is? Just as human society has hopefully evolved, hopefully the trajectory has been towards greater rather than lesser freedom, although I'm not sure about that, because there are many ways to restrict the freedom of people, and we're looking at very clever ways that people's freedom is restricted today. But hopefully freedom is the goal, and we can explore our own spirituality in our own ways. But
That's
it
really the
requires
hope.
rigor. It requires rigor. This is there's no sort of quick and easy pill to enlightenment, including the psychedelics. They're not. It's not like take ayahuasca and suddenly become enlightened. Far from it. If you're lucky, what will happen is that you'll be shown your own faults very clearly and absolutely mercilessly. But then it's up to you whether you fix those faults or not, and that's often a very difficult thing to do.
Um, yeah, before we leave this kind of historical track on the religion topic, is there any substantial evidence for kind of systematic annihilation of religious traditions worldwide? I know we had the witch trials, obviously, and
You bet. I mean, the systematic annihilation of the religions of Central and South America by the Spaniards. That was a deliberate, direct, fully focused attempt to completely rub out indigenous culture and particularly indigenous religion, and to paint it in the darkest possible light, and to bring up children with no memory of their previous heritage. Yes, it was very much done, and it was done in the name of religion. It's quite interesting to look at the states of mind that the various friars had when they went to Mexico or to Peru, and what they were trying to do there. But yes, it was systematic and largely not completely successful. There are still elements of the traditional indigenous spirituality still present in the Andes and in Mexico, but a huge effort was made to stamp them out. And yes, I mean, witch trials in Europe. I mean, what a horrific thing to do. This is something I felt needed to be pointed out, because the Spaniards were very judgmental. They were very moralistic about, for example, the Aztecs and about how the Aztecs carried out human sacrifice. But not a single Spaniard at that time seemed to pause to think, what actually is burning somebody at the stake? Burning somebody at the stake, which was routinely done in those times, is an act of human sacrifice. They're sacrificing that individual to their god, and they're burning that individual at the stake. I mean, given the choice, I'd much rather, have my heart cut out than be burnt at the stake. Burning at the stake is a horrific death, but both are acts of human sacrifice. And the Spanish were conducting human sacrifice in the form of burning at the stake, and they were condemning the Aztecs for their form of human sacrifice. Actually, both were pretty obnoxious in many ways.
Mm-hmm. All right, awesome. Thank you for that. Now, you just recently came out with a new TV series that I think is pretty, amazingly well done. Ancient Apocalypse. How long have you been working on that?
Well, that's Ancient Apocalypse. It's on Netflix, and there are 8 episodes, and each episode is about half an hour. The original proposal was put in back in 2019, and went through the normal track, which takes several months of getting accepted. But while that was happening, we also had COVID, and COVID shut much of the world down for very long periods. So most of 2020, we weren't able to film anything. It wasn't until November 2020 that we were actually on the road and filming. And the filming continued through 2021 and even into 2022. The series was finally released on the 11th of November 2022. But it was really, a 3-year project. It wouldn't have been so long if it hadn't been for COVID, and we had to make all kinds of compromises. I would love in this season, I would love to have filmed in Peru, but Peru was shut down, completely shut down because of COVID, and therefore we couldn't film there. But there's huge stories to tell in Peru. So the idea was to give a televisual treatment to various ideas and possibilities that I've explored over the years in my book. Primarily, the issue of could there be a major forgotten episode in human prehistory? The idea of a lost civilization during the Ice Age. And this is a word that's often very badly misunderstood. When I talk about a lost civilization, I do not mean something like us. I think that just as we coexist in the world today with hunter-gatherers, the world largely during the Ice Age was populated by hunter-gatherers. Out of hunter-gatherer shamanism, I think emerged a particular kind of civilization, which was solidly rooted and grounded in hunter-gatherer shamanism, which often, by the way, is a very scientific endeavor. I mean, just consider ayahuasca, which involves, putting 2 plants together, neither of which is active in its own right, but only work together. And there's so many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different species of plants and trees in the Amazon. It's a work of science to combine these two plants. So I'm looking at when I use the word civilization, I'm looking at a culture that emerged out of shamanism, that coexisted with other shamanistic cultures, but that went a bit further in a number of directions, that was capable of exploring and navigating the earth, that was capable of mapping the world during the Ice Age, and there's particular reasons why I say that. That was capable of calculating longitude, which our own culture could not calculate until the mid 18th century, that had very advanced astronomy and understanding of obscure astronomical phenomena like the precession of the equinoxes, which our archaeologists just hand that knowledge over to the Greeks, but the Greeks 2,000 years ago inherited that knowledge from earlier cultures. They attributed that knowledge to the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Egyptians inherited it from even earlier cultures. So I'm suggesting that there was, in a world largely dominated by hunter-gatherers, emerging out of hunter-gatherer shamanism, there was a culture which was capable of doing things that we don't normally today think hunter-gatherer cultures were capable of doing, such as mapping and exploring the world, and also creating gigantic megalithic structures.
Yeah, so one thing I've been watching you put out is, it keeps getting older. It's kind of the tagline. I love that.
It just keeps on getting older. My kids made me a T-shirt with that on.
So,
including me, I keep on getting older too.
So,
but the point of that is that the process of discovery of our past is ongoing. The process of discovery of our past is not fixed and finite. How things are today is not how they're going to look in 100 years' time. New information is going to come out. And one of the things that's become clearer and clearer over the last 100 years is that everything keeps getting pushed back further and further and further. So it wasn't that long ago when it was thought that anatomically modern humans were no older than 40 or 50,000 years ago. That those were 40,000 years ago was supposedly the first anatomically modern humans. This turns out to be complete rubbish. There were anatomically modern humans in Morocco more than 300,000 years ago. In Ethiopia, more than 200,000 years ago. And again, we're dealing with a very fragmentary record here. We're just making conclusions from bits of the record. But those conclusions allow us to say that anatomically modern humans certainly did not originate 40 or 50,000 years ago. They were around at least 300,000 years ago. And suddenly the horizon in which our ancestors can develop something that we would recognize as a civilization broadens enormously. The time of, if you've only got 40,000 years to play with, you're a bit restricted. But if you've got 300,000 years to play with, then you have to start asking yourself certain questions. Those ancestors of ours were identical to us. They had the same brains, they had the same bodies, the same capacity, the same ability. Why did we wait until 6,000 years ago to develop things that we call civilizations? Or are we missing part of the story? And I think we're missing part of the story. And maybe I'm not right, but I think it's worth inquiring into. I think the problem I have with archaeology's reaction to this is that they just dismiss it completely. And basically what they're saying is we archaeologists know enough about the past to be certain that there could be no lost civilization. And I'm sorry, they just don't know that. They just don't know enough about the past to be certain of that. And that was one of the reasons that I made the Ancient Apocalypse series, was to show how much of the past is not known about. I mean, it didn't go into all the figures and statistics, but it's really important to remember the Sahara Desert, 9 million square kilometers. It's hardly ever been studied by archaeology. Yes, there's a little bit of archaeology in the Sahara, but it's just scratching the surface. The flooded continental shelves, 27 million square kilometers. If archaeology looks at that, marine archaeology, they've primarily, until very recently, been looking for shipwrecks. And they haven't been considering the possibility of the inhabited continental shelves during the Ice Age. Again, that is just beginning to change. Archaeologists are showing some interest in the flooded continental shelves. And of course, the Amazon rainforest, 5 million plus square kilometers, very little archaeology done. And what is being done with LiDAR now is revealing enormous structures and the remains of huge cities that existed in the Amazon right up until the time of the Spanish conquest. And those cities were depopulated because of smallpox, just utterly wiped out the population. So in all these areas, whether it's the continental shelves, whether it's the Sahara Desert, whether it's the Amazon, whether it's the Sunda Shelf, which is we touch upon in episode 1 of Ancient Apocalypse. We look at Southeast Asia, the Malaysian Peninsula, the Indonesian islands today, and we see a sort of scattered archipelago. But back in the Ice Age, that was a huge subcontinent-sized landmass, all of it above water, and again, hardly surveyed by archaeology. So how dare archaeologists say that they've got such a grip on the past that they can absolutely rule out any possibility of a lost civilization? It's rubbish. It's arrogance. arrogance. It's hubris that archaeologists are showing there, and they should show a little more humility, in my view.
And what do you think is the cause here of, it's obvious the sea level was, a lot lower. What did you say, 300 something meters lower?
400 feet lower.
400 feet
at the
lower?
peak of the Ice Age, yeah. 400 feet lower. And 27 million square kilometers, that's Europe and China added together in terms of land area, were swallowed up by those rising seas. I mean, and that was the best real estate on Earth. That was the best land. That was where people would naturally go. And that's what swallowed up. And that's what, until very recently, archaeology has hardly paid any attention to at all. So they must stop saying that they can rule out any possibility from the past except what they believe they know, because they don't know enough. It's too early. Come back in 200 or 300 years, archaeology, when you've actually done the work, and tell me that you've ruled out a lost civilization, and I might listen. But right now, there's too much evidence for a lost civilization for me to be tempted by that at all. We need to. I'm determined to keep this inquiry going. It has produced a storm of fury and hateful comments from archaeologists. And one thing I know is when people resort to ad hominem attacks and start making up and start straw manning your argument, what I find archaeologists doing is saying Hancock says this, Hancock says that. Actually, Hancock doesn't say this or that. Hancock says something else altogether. They've got their own fantasy about what I say, and then they attack that fantasy. Well, good luck to them. But I'm going to continue this investigation. I'm convinced we're missing something important from our past, and if we don't look for it, we won't find it. So Ancient Apocalypse was intended to alert a wider public. I'm fortunate; my books have had a good following over the last 30 years, and more people are aware of this alternative evidence. But my hope with Ancient Apocalypse was that it would reach an even much wider audience and get more and more people asking questions about the past, and not necessarily just passively accepting what the so-called experts tell them. And that's a bigger problem in our society. It's not just about archaeology. I think we put too much faith in experts. So-called.
So there's a few places I want to go here. So one of your big assertions, I guess, is we're a species with amnesia. We should be trying to figure out what happened, because it seems like something catastrophic happened, a la Younger Dryas.
And something catastrophic did happen.
Right.
This is no doubt. Sorry to cut you off there.
All good.
But I have a tendency to forget chains of thought if I don't grab onto them immediately. And what there's now no doubt about is that the climatic episode called the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and roughly 11,600 years ago, was absolutely horrendous global cataclysm. And that was the time of the extinctions of the gigantic ice age megafauna. And it's a time when we know there was a bottleneck in human populations. Something really bad happened. And there are a number of theories to explain what triggered the Younger Dryas. Why did this happen? The world was coming out of the Ice Age, and then suddenly it was plunged back into the coldest imaginable temperatures, as cold as they were at the peak of the Ice Age. And then, weirdly, at the same time, sea level suddenly rose, and the massive extinctions of animal species. Obviously, something really bad happened. I personally put my vote with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is the work of more than 100 major scientists in many different universities, but it's still highly controversial, and there are many other scientists who don't accept it. But the argument is from what's called the Younger Dryas boundary layer, which is a layer in the earth about the width of a human hand, filled with what are called impact proxies, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, carbon microspherules, iridium, which are the signatures of cosmic impacts. This is found all over the world, this Younger Dryas boundary layer. It's particularly prominent in North America, but it's found in Europe, and it's found right across into Syria as well. Fascinating. The suggestion is that the Earth ran into the debris trail of a fragmenting comet, and that we were hit by multiple fragments, not a single massive impact, but dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of smaller impacts and airbursts all over the world. And that's what produced this radical event called the Younger Dryas. There are other theories. Some people think it was solar activity that was at work. I've gone into it in great depth. I favor the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, but I don't really mind. The main thing is what people need to get to grips with is that we are dealing with an episode in the very recent past, in geological terms, just less than 12,000 years ago. We're dealing with a major event that disrupted the Earth, and that's, I think, the event that lost us a whole civilization. So sorry, I
Right.
cut you off.
It's all good. I feel like you were ahead on the Younger Dryas thing, because I didn't really start seeing that in publications like New Scientist until maybe a few years after you were talking about this.
Yes, well, it's very important to be clear that the work isn't mine. The work is the work of a group called the Comet Research Group. Jim Kennett, Alan West, and many others have devoted their lives to bringing forth the evidence for a series of impacts, a comet swarm striking the Earth 12,800 years ago. They've published not just dozens, but hundreds of peer-reviewed academic papers on this. There's been huge resistance to it because there is, within science and within geology, a uniformitarian tendency. People kind of back off from cataclysms. Trying to explain anything in terms of a cataclysm is somehow still politically incorrect. And that's, I think, why there's been this reaction to it. But when you look at the facts on the ground, the Younger Dryas was a cataclysm, and whatever caused it, it was a big enough cataclysm to wipe out parts of the human story.
Mm. Yeah. So, we're dealing with things like climate change. We're just now beginning to pay attention to things like asteroid strikes.
Yeah.
And just kind of barely. I feel like it's really inadequate relative to the risk.
That's right, and it is an ongoing risk. I really don't want to be a spreader of gloom and doom at all. But the Earth orbits in a very hazardous cosmic environment, filled with objects that can overnight completely change the story of life on Earth, just as happened 66 million years ago with the KPG impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. That completely changed the story of life on Earth just overnight. The dinosaurs were gone, apart from chickens and other birds, and the mammals were able to thrive in a way that they would not have thrived without that impact. And it's only a matter of time before another such very large impact happens. But in the meantime, I urge science to pay attention to the Taurid meteor stream, which is the meteor stream that the Comet Research Group are also focusing on as the likely culprit. And the debris from that fragmented comet is still orbiting in the Taurid meteor stream, and the Earth still passes through it twice a year.
Right. And, I guess perhaps apocryphal, but the Atlantis story being a great example of things we need to pay attention to ourselves. We've become more powerful than Zeus, and
God, yes. I mean, we tick all the boxes for the next lost civilization. And the Atlantis story, this again is another area where I find myself in conflict with archaeology, because archaeologists insist, with no evidence whatsoever, that the Atlantis story was simply some sort of political or philosophical fable. Plato was seeking to make a philosophical and political point with the Atlantis story. What they forget is that the Atlantis story is one of thousands of traditions from all around the world, thousands of traditions that speak of a huge, all-destroying global flood, that speak of the destruction of a golden age in the human story, and that speak of the gods punishing humanity for some error or something that was done terribly wrong. In the case of Atlantis, it was hubris, it was pride, it was arrogance, it was imposing their power on other peoples around the world. And Plato expresses this as the gods striking back. But the bottom line is that Atlantis in Plato's story, and again, it's important to make this point, that Plato's story, according to Plato, reached him through his ancestor Solon, through his family line, and is based on a visit that Solon made to Egypt, a well-known visit. Nobody doubts that it happened around 600 BC, where he talked to Egyptian priests in many temples. And priests in the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta told him the story of Atlantis. And that story was passed down, eventually reaching Plato, and he reports it in his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Well, The important thing about that story is that when Solon asked the Egyptian priests for a date, when was Atlantis submerged? They answered 9,000 years ago. Very, very matter of fact. It was 9,000 years ago. Well, that was in 600 BC. So this is where it becomes important to do the math. That's 9,600 BC in our calendar. That's 11,600 years ago. That's the end of the Younger Dryas. Began 12,800 years ago, finished 11,600 years ago. And it finished with a colossal pulse of meltwater called Meltwater Pulse 1b at exactly 11,600 years ago. So it's an extraordinary coincidence, if Plato made the whole thing up, that his lost civilization is being flooded by a rise in sea level at a time when we know that such a rise took place. And it's one of many reasons why I think the Plato story needs to be taken seriously. I'm also working with another brilliant researcher on this subject, and there's more to tell about the Atlantis-Egypt connection, which will be revealed later this year.
We try to insert as much Plato as we can. And,
incredible mind. Incredible mind.
The biggest thing I think people should take away is that the relationship between ancient Greece and Egypt was similar to early America and England, right? Like people would go to school and then come back. And then, very similar.
Parallel. Mm-hmm. It's a reasonable parallel. And the Greeks, honestly said that they owed everything to the Egyptians. There was never a sort of revolution again. Well, actually, the way there was, because under Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian, not a Greek, but nevertheless, they took over Egypt from about 300 BC, round about until the time of Christ, and when Egypt was then taken over by the Romans. What's interesting is that the Greeks fully honored Egyptian traditions, and in many ways, they became the Ptolemaics. The Ptolemies became more Egyptian than the Egyptians. And some of those late Ptolemaic temples, whether you're looking at the Temple of Edfu, Temple of Horus at Edfu, whether you're looking at Philae, at Dendera, they're incredible temples. They fully honor the ancient Egyptian system. And it's as though the Ptolemaic system was, yes, they physically colonized Egypt, but the ancient Egyptians colonized their minds. With Rome, it became different. Rome changed the tune completely, and that was the beginning of the end of ancient Egypt. But the Greek presence in ancient Egypt was much more harmonious.
So I want to, maybe got about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about this concept of scientism. We mentioned it a bit at the beginning. You got in some, let's call it trouble at Tedx a while ago. You're in good company, Rupert Sheldrake. Who could ask for better company?
We're at the same talk. We at the same event, and both our talks were banned by TED. I mean, banned in the sense that TED took them off their own channel. Then there was a huge public outcry. Quite a number of people had downloaded the talk, and they re-uploaded it to YouTube. And then TED faced a dilemma, because if they started trying to force it to be taken down from all these YouTube channels, it would look even more like censorship. So they'd left it there, and as a result, it got millions of views, which it probably wouldn't have got if it had just stayed on the TED channel. And then TED re-uploaded it to their channel, but with quote unquote context, explaining why they'd done what they'd done. And the argument was, that neither Rupert nor I were presenting true science. I mean, what the hell is true science? Why is it unscientific to talk about consciousness? Why is it unscientific to talk about telepathy as Rupert does? This is science should not define these artificial boundaries within which it's okay and outside which you're beyond the pale. Everything should be open to scientific inquiry.
So from what I read in the comments on the TED page, one of the big things they didn't like about your talk was mentioning that people experience entities in DMT experiences.
Yes,
and that's
right. That's right.
It's categorically true. It does happen. Yeah. Happens in clinical research. Happens on everybody's couch.
Absolute fact. And yet the science, the TED's science board rule entities out. Sorry, guys, entities are impossible. We at TED know better. Well, they should go take some DMT and see whether they know better after that. And thank goodness that I'm sure you're aware of the projects that are now being done at Imperial College in London and at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. With DMT, with extended release DMT, volunteers are going into the DMT state for an hour and they're making remarkably homogeneous reports about entity encounters and about the space in which they encounter those entities. And, one reasonable supposition has to be there are many possibilities for this, but when people from all over the world see the same things, have the same encounters in the same sort of space, you have to consider the possibility that that space is real. In some way that our science doesn't recognize, that it's not just internal, that there's something else going on. I like the idea of the brain as a receiver of consciousness. It's a well-known model within psychedelic studies, that the brain is not generating consciousness, but it's allowing consciousness through. It's a sort of transceiver. And once you accept that model, then all kinds of so-called impossible things become possible.
So do you have a definition you like of scientism? I like to see it as kind of the tradition of logical positivism, like Bertrand Russell's whole field, kind of formalized to say like the only thing we can talk about is stuff that's replicable in a lab, talk about in a meaningful way. But how do you like to talk about scientism?
Well, it's a most unfortunate development, which is limiting the field of inquiry unnecessarily. And when we say scientism, we need also to attach those other ugly words, materialist reductionism, is that it's all about matter, that everything must be reduced to matter and to a material explanation. And this is so odd at a time when we're beginning to understand that actually there's no such thing as matter. Quantum physics is getting to grips with this. What is matter apart from empty space? Really for science to reach these fixed and firm ideas, I think science in that way is operating with a 19th century model rather than with a 21st century model. And it needs to upgrade its efforts to deal with this. And we must stop confining ourselves to what can be weighed and measured and counted. And we must give value and validity to experiences.
And we actually see this coming up more and more lately. People are identifying it as kind of a colonial mindset. This logical positivist scientism thing, saying, you shamans are clearly wildly ignorant and know nothing.
Exactly. That's exactly what the logical positive science is saying. Is it's dismissing and sneering at the huge accumulated experience of shamanism over tens of thousands of years, which is an experience that tells us that reality is much more complicated than it appears to be on the surface, and which has developed very sophisticated techniques for dealing with that broadened reality. And yet Western science sneers at that and says, they're just mistaken. Western science knows nothing about this matter. I'm very glad that the investigation into entity encounters is taking place with DMT, certainly at Imperial College, and I believe at Johns Hopkins as well. I'm very glad that's happening because it's one of the first times that science has been applied to psychedelics, not looking for a therapeutic outcome, but looking to understand the experience and what is going on with that. And we need more of that. It's great. The therapeutic outcomes of plant medicines are wonderful, and they've helped to make it permissible for people who previously would have sneered at plant medicines to consider the incredible mystery of these medicines in a way that they would not have done before. But we also need to look at the experiences and what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give a shout out to Andrew Gallimore, who was recently published on your site. He was just on our podcast.
And I think Andrew introduced us.
That's right.
Andrew is a fantastically important researcher in this field. And the work he has done is going to be recognized centuries from now as breakthrough work. I have huge admiration and respect for Andrew Gallimore. And of course, he's also fundamental to the exploration of extended state DMT, because one of the problems with smoked or vaped DMT is it's so sudden and so fast and so over with so quickly, and to get any meaningful, useful account, you need to have somebody in that state for longer. And Andrew, together with Rick Strassman, have been fundamental in creating that technology. So I would urge and anybody who's interested in deeper explanations into psychedelics to look at the work of Andrew Gallimore.
Yeah. He his new book, what was it, Reality Switch Technologies, and the other one, Alien Information Theory.
Technology, yes, really, really excellent. We've got that on my website at the moment, actually.
Great. And in regards to this entity topic, we don't talk about it too much explicitly, though. we're very transpersonally focused, so people can have these experiences. Doesn't mean we know the what, why
No, we
behind
don't.
them.
We don't know the what, why at all. We don't know what's going on.
And maybe this is an interesting bridge, maybe. So an entity like Quetzalcoatl, hugely important to ancient Mesoamerican culture. Um, we have a few possible scenarios, right? A human that came over, a myth, a psychedelic or other visionary experience, ETs, or who knows, transdimensional entities.
Yeah.
You know, we just don't have the data, right? Like we can't make that leap to say this is what it is.
Well, the feathered serpent aspect of Quetzalcoatl is a classic visionary entity. No doubt about that at all. And you meet feathered serpents in ancient Egyptian art as well. So there's no doubt that visionary elements are an important part of this. This is another thing that archaeology and history have to get to terms with, is that psychedelics and experiences in altered states of consciousness have actually been foundational and fundamental to human culture. And by pretending that they're not, as we've been doing for the last 50 years, we're making a huge mistake. We have to change that outlook and welcome and embrace what these gifts of the universe have to give us, and use them wisely, with care.
Okay. Other than reading your books, what would you suggest young, PhDs, master's level students, be doing to try to flesh out their understanding beyond this kind of narrow frame that they're allowed to operate in?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, think for yourself. Don't be told what to think, including by me. We need to carve our own path into the mystery of being human, and we need to recognize that hardly anything is solved. We've solved sort of surface level problems, but the real problems, the real issues. I mean, for example, how did life begin on Earth? Everybody. This is itself a huge mystery, which remains to this day completely unexplained. And how different species evolve, and evolution itself. We're just scratching the surface. There's so much more work to do. So scientism just needs a little bit, or perhaps a lot more humility, and a lot more willingness to embrace other approaches. And the shamanistic approach to the investigation of reality would be very helpful if Western science could adopt elements of that rather than just sneering at it.
Agreed. Yeah. People need to really stretch their wings, yeah. It's the Timothy Leary line we like to say, think for yourself, question authority. And,
Yeah,
I think
exactly. That's what it comes down to. Think for yourself and question authority. Of course, it's also important to do the research and do the legwork and read the books and read the journal articles. But know your subject, but fundamentally think for yourself. Don't follow a line of thought you've been told to follow. And out of that comes novelty. We start finding out new things that we wouldn't find if we stuck in the existing pattern. And that's another interesting aspect of psychedelics is novelty. What do they generate in us that is new or that we hadn't recognized before? And that often and frequently happens. In my case, it gave me the opportunity to write some novels. I hadn't really thought of myself as writing novels at all, but in between my nonfiction work, I have written some novels, and those novels arose out of ayahuasca experiences. And in a way, ayahuasca showed me that, yes, fundamentally, I am a nonfiction writer, but I have other creative abilities that I can explore, and I've done so, and I've found it, very, very helpful for me as a person. So I think this is also one of the reasons why psychedelics are helpful therapeutically, breaking people out of a deep depression. What is a deep depression except a rigid, fixed pattern of thought where you repetitively go around and around and around again the same miserable ideations? And I think that one of the reasons that psychedelics help to change that is that they break that fixed pattern and they set you free of it and allow you to think in novel ways that you hadn't thought before.
Well, Graham, this has been amazing. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Anything else you want to plug?
No, I think we're good. I think we're all good. My books are out there. My website is the key sort of portal to my work. My Facebook and Twitter pages are linked on that as well. So go to the website, grahamhancock.com.
Amazing. All right. Thanks so much, Graham. Until next time.